So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Sylvain Chassang from Princeton, my colleague, here with us. Hi, Sylvain.
Hi.
Sylvain will talk about strategic energy purchases, and the emphasis is on strategic. He will teach us about a new proposal he has with Johan Ortner and myself, how one could redesign energy markets to make it more stable and less volatile. So before we give the floor to Sylvain, let me just give a few slides of opening remarks, and then I will highlight Sylvain, the poll questions you answered. So first thing I would like to say that, if you look at the world energy dependency, you see that, oil, which is, the red bar, is still a very big chunk of what we're consuming worldwide. Of course, it's different from the country to country, but worldwide is still a huge component. And then, the blue one is the gas, which is also natural gas, which is very important. And equally, almost equally important is the yellow one, which is the coal. And then you see nuclear and other hydro and other aspects showing up at a much smaller scale. And hopefully through renewable energy, we can actually change the landscape. And so this graph is taken from the Bank of International Settlements. And, it shows the different energy mix we're having so far and how much it is growing. What's also important is that we have some dependencies on these energies. And we want to get rid of these dependencies. And they're also interdependent. So different energy sources are interdependent as well. So for example, if we have more renewable energies, that means that we will depend more on the volatility of the weather. So if weather there's less windy, hence there's less wind energy. That would mean that we will actually have then a higher demand for natural gas, because nuclear is a very stable supply of energy. You can't switch it on and off very easily. Gas, you can switch really easily on and off. That means, given that renewable is more volatile, the more volatile your other energy sources are, the more you need some energies which you can switch on and off very easily. So that's actually, everything is interdependent. Depending what you rely on, you also need the other sources. You have more or less demand for that. But if you look at oil, for example, and typically energy prices, they're highly volatile. And one of the questions was, why are they so volatile? So here I've depicted the price of a barrel of oil and at the European market. And you see essentially, it's around below $20. It was below $20 very recently during the height of the COVID crisis. And then even before the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, you had essentially a huge increase of oil prices, and then the invasion of Russia and Ukraine led to an even bigger increase subsequently, and it's a six-fold increase. The volatility is very, very high, and the question is this volatility excessive? This was the first question. And the answer to that is, and the answers you gave to, do you think that the energy prices are excessively volatile? Here I've just shown you the oil price, and actually people thought, 54% thought that's excessively volatile, 46% thought it is not excessively volatile. The second question was a little bit a tricky question, where I said, can you decrease prices by increasing demand? Normally said, if demand goes up, the price goes up, but can you actually increase the demand and then make the price at the same time go down? And 15% of the people thought, yes, you can do that, but 85% of the people think you cannot do that. And that's essentially, we will see whether Sylvain can enlighten us in this regard, whether you can actually increase demand and at the same time the price is going down, which seems like a violation of the law of demand. And we will see this in a strategic environment, whether it's possible or not. The third question is, would actually OPEC increase supply if Europe would reduce its oil imports from Russia? And the answer for that question was 62% thought OPEC actually would increase oil supply. There's just some news coming out today, and that's what people thought, and the rest, so 38% thought no, they would not. The final question, would actually, when we do some contracting to provide some security for some energy suppliers with fixed prices in the long run, so advanced purchase agreements, would this be easier to arrange if it's done with domestic suppliers of energy, like fracking in the US, and so forth? Always would be equally easy to do it with foreigners. And the majority thought, it would be easier to do it with domestic suppliers, and would be more difficult to do it with foreigners. So with this quick opening remarks, I will pass on the mic, the digital mic, to Sylvain, who will tell us how we could design and redesign a global energy market, in particular the oil market, such that oil prices might be less volatile, and we could also strategically use the environment, given that on the one side we have a cartel. What have you learned from other literatures in procurement and micro theory? What have you learned, and how can we use this knowledge to have a more socially well-functioning energy market for all of us? And Sylvain, the floor is yours, and I'm really looking forward to your expositions.
So thank you all for coming to this talk. So like Markus said, this is joint work with Markus and Juan Ortner, and the question is, how can we manage energy prices through a strategic use of our purchase capacity? We had sort of two main challenges in mind when we started working on this project. The first one, is sort of obvious. It's the high energy prices that we're currently dealing with. They're problematic for two reasons. They help support a belligerent Russia. They limit the ways in which Europe and the West can take action. The second is that they fuel inflation. Even though energy prices are not a huge part of the CPI, it's a very visible part of the CPI. Whenever I drive around, I see the price of gasoline, and so it likely has an outsized weight in terms of setting up inflation expectation. It also there are all sorts of social inequality issues between cities and rural citizens that are sort of important. The second challenge, is that of supply network resilience. In some sense, the current energy crisis and the related fuel crisis are sort of exercises in how to mount coordinated responses to supply challenges, with the stakes being pretty clear and pretty high. Like if we don't have a successful coordinated response to these challenges, what people are going to do is, they're going to revert to autarky and protectionism. And we've seen some elements of that happen, especially in the food market. Okay, and so we're going to try and provide some ideas related to this that with oil as a case study, but that hopefully can be applied to other communities and key inputs. Okay, so those are the problems. We have a specific expertise to bring. So people have made a number of policy proposals in this domain. Some have been around the idea of taxing Russian oil and, based on an understanding of elasticities. The specific expertise we have is that of collusion in procurement. So with Juan Ortner and other co-authors, Kei Kawai and Jun Kobayashi, over the last 7+ years, we've been doing a lot of work on understanding how to deal with procurement issues when you're facing a cartelized oligopolistic market with high entry costs. Okay, and it's something that local governments face, that most firms face, and in some sense it applies to the current situation. Like the market for oil is essentially oligopolistic with a lot of cartel leadership by let's say OPEC and OPEC plus. And the reason we think this expertise is relevant is that the economics of cartelized markets are really quite different from the economics of competitive markets. Okay, and that's this point about could you increase demand and lower prices? What happens here is that insights that you get from the usual marginal analysis of the supply curve is probably wrong because it is a cartelized market. You have strategic players. So some of the policies you get from a marginal analysis are going to have issues. And at the same time, there are some good news, right? We have identified, people who deal with procurement have identified, policy solutions to this issue of procuring in a cartelized oligopolistic market. In particular, these markets are kind of so inefficient that there are going to be some free lunches around because you start from something that's very much a second or third best. Okay, and that's where our proposal is going to have something original to contribute. There's going to be a different set of trade-offs to the ones that have been proposed so far. Okay, so let me walk you briefly through the talk. I'm going to start by giving you a relatively simple framework to understand this cartelized market. There's going to be what I'm going to call the cartel discipline equation. It just tells me when does a participant in a cartelized economy, they don't have to be a formal cartel member, they could just be some producer in an oligopolistic cartelized economy, choose to increase production a little bit more. Okay. Then I'll get into the policy proposal. So, it's going to be a case for a strategic energy procurement board with the following sort of, bargain in mind, that it's not that we want to go from very high and volatile prices to volatile low prices. The bargain that I'm going to try and articulate is one in which we go from high volatile prices to moderately high and stable prices, right? And I'm going to argue that it's a sort of win-win-win because there is something for producers, something for consumers. They essentially co-insure one another, and there is potentially something for environmental stakeholders because high prices of energy also mean that there is a stable market for renewables to plan their entry. Okay. One reason why, I think we thought we had something to contribute here is that unlike many proposals to deal with high prices right now, we do not operate through demand reduction, right? If you have a competitive market, that's really the only way you get to reduce prices, just to reduce demand. Here, we're going to try and leverage a sort of understanding of how cartels and oligopolistic markets work and use at least some component of demand strategically to affect industry conduct and industry structure, okay? And, so we're going to try and operate on a different margin, and that's going to make for, at least a different set of pressure points, not that there are not challenges related to this proposal, but at least in terms of, paying to the consumer, it's going to, I think it's going to be milder, okay? And we'll do our best to take emissions target into account as well. All right. And in the third part of the talk, I'll say, okay, well, this insights we had about cartelized markets, led us to this proposal that's kind of useful, but they also refine and inform our understanding of how other policies might work out. Okay. And so I'll talk briefly about those at the end. Okay. Any questions? All right.
I think that's a nice overview.
Okay, so let me get started with our framework. Okay, so people in the throughout the G7, Joe Biden especially, have been pretty vocal about getting oil producers, whether it's OPEC or whether it's people operating in the Marcellus Shale, to produce more with very little response. Okay, today there was some announcement, but they just said that the speed of increase would go from 400,000 barrels a day per month to 700 barrels per month increase per month out of a world consumption that is maybe 100 million barrels a day at the time, so it's a small amount. Okay, so let's understand this problem a little bit. What does a producer take into account when choosing to increase its production, right? And so I'm operating in a Cournot market where people compete in quantities. All right, so I'm an oil producer and I'm considering whether I should increase my production by some delta Q positive. I'm going to choose not to increase supply. So cartel discipline will hold if the following, essentially if the change in profits, if the change in the net present value of profits is negative, right? So if this change in production does not help me as a strategic intertemporal producer. And there are three terms to this. The first term is the one that's we're familiar from marginal analysis. Okay, that's the one you get from a price-taking producer. It's saying, essentially, what are my profits on a marginal unit? Okay, I produce delta Q, and I make, the price of that delta Q is P, and I have to pay a marginal cost MC to produce that. So that's my margin. This is my margin. This is the quantity. That's the profit on the marginal unit. And that's where we'd stop if we thought this was a competitive market. The second term corresponds to what we have once we realize that the market is oligopolistic, right? So because I produce more, I have a price impact on the world price of oil, right? So I produce more, the price of oil drops. This changes the value of my inframarginal production, right? So if I produce an extra 100,000 barrels a day, that lowers the price of oil, that lowers the value of the rest of my production. So if I was producing 1 million barrels a day before, I've now lowered the value of that production. And the third term is the one that comes from the fact that we have a cartel, and a cartel that punishes people. In particular, you can have price wars. And they can be violent, or they can be slow. You can slowly undermine the prices, or you can, really have a price war. And what that does is, this really changes producers' continuation values. Okay, and so typically,
so this price war could be occasionally of whole cycles. Now the price war gets more severe, and then it goes away again. So you have these cycles and price wars. That's all in the delta V term, or?
Yes, so that would be all in the delta V term, and how big that term is will kind of depend on the circumstances. I'll talk about that. But right now, they just had a price war, they got out of it. Now we think that term is big. I will get back to this. Okay, so this is the term that you take into account when you have a competitive view of the market. This is what you take into account when you realize that you're dealing with an oligopolistic cartelized market. And these are the terms that are going to give me, room to imagine useful policies. Okay. Any questions?
Not so far.
Okay, so let me take this simple framework for a spin and sort of use it to understand why we think this is, kind of a good moment for oil producers right now. The first one is we think the cartel is in a strong position. We think that this term delta V, right, this sort of threat of collusion. So, you're going to have, typically we think of that term as positive, and then that term price impact is going to be negative, and that term as negative, right? So if we are in a cartel situation, well, people would like, they could make money on a marginal unit, but then they worry about the inframarginal price impact, that's the oligopolistic force, and then they worry about, getting into a price war, or undermining cartel stability. It's a variant of a price war. It doesn't have to be, super bad. It just could be less good than now. And so you're going to have cartel discipline whenever these negative terms overwhelm this positive term over here. Okay. So now when I'm going to say, we think it's a moment where the cartel is in a strong position, I'm going to say, we think these two terms here are big and negative right now. Okay, so the first point is we think the cartel is in a strong position. That means this, this potential change in continuation values if, you start producing more is large and negative.
So Sylvain, the question is there some tacit collusion? Everything is whether it's an open, the governance structure of the cartel probably matters a lot what the delta V is. I think.
Yeah, here it's both, right? So OPEC does open collusion, right? And so, you have these proposals to sue them under, some statutes that don't exist, some antitrust statutes that would have to be voted in, and they haven't been voted in. It's this OPEC proposal. And so OPEC, is an actual, known cartel and they communicate they had a meeting today, they made some decision to have a tiny increase in their production. But then you also have a number of people who are sort of followers. They are not formal OPEC members. So Russia is sort of on the fringe. It's the plus in OPEC plus. You know, they are not a formal OPEC members, but they're still, you know, responding to this force, right? So if they start producing a lot more, there may be a response from OPEC. So regardless or not you want to participate in the cartel's behavior will influence your behavior. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So back in this point that we think one of the reasons the cartel is in a strong position now is this delta V, this threat of punishment is sort of credible right now, incredibly large. A large part for this is that they actually just went through a price war. So in 2020, Russia and OPEC, it's the beginning of the pandemic. They were wondering about softer demand. They decided to, OPEC, decided to reduce production targets. Russia said no. They went through a price war in which Saudi Arabia, essentially offered bilateral deals to the US, Europe, and Asia to basically supply them at $6 under the world prices, right? So big time price war at the time, okay? That's how we end up at some point with, negative prices, okay?
So that if you look at the volatility of oil prices, which I said, multiplied by 6 and all that, or more than 6, is it to a large extent due to price war phenomena? Would you say it's a big contributor to volatility, or is it other forces?
I think it might contribute to jumps. So if you think of something that's really, the day today is different from tomorrow, where things can really switch on within an hour. It's those decisions made by individuals. And here I think it's fair to say that you have a handful of individuals who have an outsized impact on world prices of oil. And so I think the big jump components that are really hard to insure for, I think they are plausibly linked to strategic behavior by members of the cartel and the people around it. Okay, the other part of this is, so now we think because they just went through a price war, it's pretty credible. The cartel has quite a bit of right. There's a pretty big, these things are pretty credible. A second aspect to this is, Russia and the OPEC only just recently reached an uneasy truce. And, Russia has been playing ball, even though Russia is typically a sort of unreliable partner to OPEC. And so it's a tricky moment for OPEC members who've been courting Russia and fighting Russia, but they've just reached a truce to sort of defect on them right now. So when the West is asking for OPEC to step up, that's effectively a defection within the cartel's equilibrium. And that's a hard ask right now. And it's pretty clear why you'd have to compensate OPEC members quite heavily if you wanted them to do that, okay? There are other aspects about, making up for past losses. A second point, that I think is, more speculative in a sense, is this idea that right now at the current price we are at, it seems like demand is a bit inelastic, okay? And so changes in supply, likely have a large price impact. So that's an argument that this delta T term, this, the impact of a marginal production on the value of the rest of your production is going to be large and negative, right? So, that's the view you'd have if you think that we're now at a price quantity pair where demand is inelastic. And it's consistent with the fact that, maybe we are at lower consumption levels, but in some sense it's consumption that's inelastic. The uses that are still around are uses that really matter to us. And so additional production would lower prices quite a bit. And that will make the oligopoly work better, that will reinforce cartel discipline.
So what time frame do you have in mind here? Is it more like over a quarter? Because the elasticity of demand depends, of course, if the price stays high for a while, people readjust. If it's a more longer time frame, then the elasticity is actually different than compared if it's a very short horizon change, and you can't.
No, I mean, that's for sure. So it's quite plausible that if you are going to look at this demand, not averaged over a quarter, but averaged over a year or 2 years, it would be much more elastic as people, people can find substitutes or people rearrange their production needs, so I agree with this.
So how often does OPEC change its quantity considerations? Every quarter? Or that's probably the time frame you have to think about in this case, no?
No, here I don't know that delta Q is necessarily something that happens at a set frequency. You're asking me something where I don't have the data to give you a data-driven answer. I think this is the fact that now the intuition that now we're in an inelastic part of the demand. I think this is speculative. I don't know I don't have the data to draw for you the rest of the demand. So I'm going to punt on this question. Do you have an answer to the question, Markus?
No, I don't. That's why I'm asking the question to you. But I think probably it should be more shorter time horizon perspective you have here, no?
No, I agree. So I agree. I think these inelasticity in demand, they really matter because they're very painful over the short run. Over the medium run, we have many good reasons to think that these are much less painful. But
in a sense, you can move things which are in the delta P, you can move it to the delta V. It either shows up in delta P or in delta V. Probably similar impact then.
Sure. I think that's quite plausible. The people who can have a price impact are probably affected by both. Okay. All right. So that's the argument, that's what, the reading you get of why it's been hard for suppliers to step up their production and why they've been unresponsive in the current setting. Even though the price is really high and it's above marginal cost for a lot of countries, even outside of OPEC, oligopolistic and collusive forces are, sort of pushing producers away from increasing production. In the case of OPEC and Russia, that equation should probably also include behavioral terms. Like you have two men, Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, who are people and have an outsized impact on those decisions that may not be profit driven. And so, that's going to reinforce this strategic term here, There are going to be other components to that than just, future profits.
So Laura Allen has a question. She says that, the total oil demand is actually below the pre-COVID level because China has this huge lockdown experience and all this, and there's still a weak energy demand from the rest of from the West. She thinks that it's the war of Russia, which has a big impact.
So I think that's certainly, consistent. But again, you could have an argument, this is acting through stockpiling. A variant of this is, the prices had been going up before the price to Russia. I think they had a clear plan to not increase production too fast. And that, the current issues with Russia is just, something that, kind of also increases the cartel's incentives to take advantage of this moment to sustain supra-competitive prices. But I think it's, the idea that we are now at the relative, not at the highest consumption level, and yet have high prices is consistent with the view that I'm developing over here. It's really that, supply is not being competitive. Supply is being at least oligopolistic and, I think very much collusive, right? So low quantities and high prices, it's a sign that supply is being more restricted than it should. So I think it's a view that's consistent with the one that I'm developing here. Okay. Okay, so that one of the takeaways here that I want to insist on is those guys just went through a price war. They just got out of it. It's always tricky between Russia and OPEC. You can kind of understand why they don't want to deviate on Russia right now. Okay, and that I think it's important to have that in mind when you think about why don't those guys increase production. So now I'm going to take this view of oil markets as being cartelized and oligopolistic, and use it to develop one policy proposal. Okay, and the view is going to be that of strategic energy procurement. So it's going to be the idea that we're going to use some of our demand in a strategic manner to support a policy goal, which is that of stable energy prices at some high but reasonable target. Okay, and I'm going to pretend that let's imagine that we do this through what I'm going to call a procurement board, that is a supranational entity that's able to make advanced purchase commitments, so basically enter in bilateral forward relationships with energy producers. That's clearly something you could discuss, right? So there are supranational entities that deal with energy market. The IEA is one example. They don't do purchase themselves. They coordinate countries. I think there are ways to organize the proposal around, a scheme like this one. I'm going to assume that we have this supranational entity that's able to make these purchase commitments. Okay, and behind this board, you'd have member countries, mandating the board to allocate some of their long-term demand at some agreed upon forward price. So at what I'm going to call a high but reasonable target price, if I had to imagine something, let's say, $70 a barrel. Okay, and then that's what the board gets to play with. It's going to use this endowment, basically, of purchasing capacity in two ways. The first one is to affect industry conduct, to allocate the demand strategically to affect industry conduct in three ways. The first one is to encourage entry. Okay. The second one is, so that's dealing with the fact that you have high fixed costs in these markets and the price is really, really very volatile, just like Markus illustrated at the beginning. The second one, and that one, I think people can argue about how feasible it is and what size of commitments you'd have to make, but it's going to be to potentially try and weaken cartel discipline. I'll talk about this part in some more detail. And the third one, and I think this third one is really important when you think about the way procurement is done in practice by firms who are very good at this, is basically going to be to encourage self-regulation by the cartel. It's to say, sure, we need to have some ammunition to deal with, misbehavior sometimes, but ideally what we'd like to do is sort of cooperate with the cartel. Sometimes I say we really would like to join the cartel in a sense, and that's going to dovetail in a useful way with this perspective of resilience. Okay. The second aspect of the board's processes is going to be to use the forward supply it sources to do two things. The first one is to try and increase the elasticity of residual demand by allocating this supply to the high willingness to pay inelastic components of demand. So it's going to be softened demand. And the second one is to try and encourage participation at scale by member countries. Okay. All right. So the first use of demand.
Just to make sure that I fully understand. So the idea is not that the buyers form a purchasing cartel and say we cut back on our demand. So the idea is much more, I promise I will have some demand down the road in 1 or 2 years.
Absolutely.
To the suppliers. So
rather
than cutting back, I make essentially offer some supply demand certainty for the next few years.
Exactly. I mean, it's very closely related to this idea of advanced market commitments that were used during Operation Warp Speed to guarantee a market for the vaccines. It's really about using, potentially expanding demand and medium-term demand in a strategic way. The first way to use this demand is going to be to encourage entry, and so we could talk about people drilling shale, people in the Permian Basin. How do we get more of these producers to enter, especially since those guys can actually get to production relatively fast. And that's really going to be the standard use of advanced commitments, is going to be to de-risk entry for marginal suppliers. Right now, prices a year from now are very volatile. There could be another drop in demand. There could be another price war. It's just a really hard entry decisions. The shale industry got burned, by price wars that happened in the recent past, by drops in prices that happened in the recent past. It's difficult for them to enter. All right.
Does this entry have to happen in equilibrium, or is it just an off equilibrium threat?
Okay. So I'll come to this. So, and I think you want a bit of both. So if you think about the way, really good procurement offices manage their suppliers, if you think about, the way Toyota manage, its parts supplier, one aspect is to always ensure that you have multiple suppliers that you can go to, enough suppliers that you can go to. And another aspect of this is that you don't punish them just because they are making a profit. In fact, you want them to make a profit so that they're around in the first place, right? So if Toyota always allocated to the smallest bidder, to the lowest bidder, maybe you'd have 1 or 2 guys, and you wouldn't have a competitive fringe to discipline the market. So you need to give your suppliers some fat to eat off of, so that they stick around, so that they provide you with hard to contract dimensions of service like quality, just-in-time provision, that they won't screw you over the moment you are weak. Right now we would like OPEC to play ball a little bit. There is no contract between OPEC and West and consuming countries. We would like to have a more productive relationship, and so I think you want to do a bit of both. You want to have some understanding of how to maintain a competitive fringe, but you only want to scale it up and get really aggressive with the use of these measures if your supply partners don't play ball. Okay, someone talked about non-fossil fuel alternatives, and the questions, I'll come to that in a second. Okay, so the way you de-risk entry for marginal suppliers is to enter with them into long-term, medium-term. I think the shale, a new shale oil well in the shale industry is probably profitable over 2 years. So that might be the time horizon you need to start making a difference. So you enter these medium or long-term bilateral forward contracts at these high but reasonable prices. That's going to be a theme. And importantly, you don't put them on the open futures market, because then the contract could be picked up by anybody, including Saudi Arabia. But because you want to specifically get more entry, because once they're around, they can compete, you want to target these contracts to entrants, okay? And this could be entrants in the standard, oil and gas market, but it could also be entrants that are going to make a difference on the, also on the gas market. For instance, it could be renewable electricity, right? So if you have, and it could be also supporting infrastructure. So, somebody that enters and has, electricity grid solutions or, electricity storage solutions also essentially, reduces demand for gas in the medium run. Okay, so I think these are all part of, the mandate of the board.
So the board has to act very strategically. So it has to be a bunch of game theorists and combined with technological knowledge.
Yeah, and actually, I think finance people. So I think, I think there's a lot of understanding of what affects the price of gas that comes from, people who bet on the price of gas. And so, and understanding how you finance this thing, this object, this institution, I think is really important for, political expediency as well. You want to make sure that it's financed in a way that doesn't, leave, participating members with a large bill at the end of the day.
Well, let's suppose this agency is an international agency. Then there are also this national interests coming into play. Isn't this an additional challenge, or how would you deal with that?
Yeah. I think it's a little bit, what I find helpful here is I think a lot of this can be done. You don't need that much coordination to do a plan like this. I think this is, something that the US could do on its own. I think it's something that the EU could do on its own, probably with different targets for entry. I think you probably want to coordinate it in the way the IEA coordinates, oil reserves, so that, we don't all target the same people. But, if the US unilaterally decides to give, 2-year, forward contracts to its own shale industry, maybe this needs to be negotiated so that it's not a breach of, WTO rules. But I think that could be pretty effective. If Europe decides to finance, better electricity grids or better, more liquid natural gas terminals or, gas connections between Spain and the rest of Europe, I think that's quite effective, even in a relatively unilateral way. So this could be a pitch for using not just, releasing the strategic oil reserves when it's needed, but also sourcing the strategic oil reserve in a particular way. Okay.
So coming back to the only thing, and you think the coordination is much easier because it's not about restricting your own demand. It's just extending guarantees for some price.
Absolutely, that's exactly it, right? If it's about reducing oil demand, then if prices are low and I'm reducing, I'd like to buy a little bit on the side. Here, you're expanding demand. You hope that the prices are low, but it's not like you want to take advantage of it immediately, right? So I think the nature of incentive, you have some issues about will people participate at scale if they don't like this idea? In some sense, when you are guaranteeing demand at some horizon, you're basically endowing the purchase board with a put option, that has some value. That's roughly, 10% of the strike price, because I'm looking at prices that are out of the money. There is some cost to that. There's also organizational cost, but these are much smaller in some sense than, reducing, now I'm going to have to tell people that they can only take their car every other day, or, that they're going to have to restrict electricity consumption.
So would this proposal be helpful in order to get more energy independent down the road, or is the whole focus more?
I think that's exactly. I'm going to let me talk about these 2 points again. So again, how does a clever procurement office manage its suppliers? It keeps enough of them around, so you are more resilient if you have more sources, and that's part of the mission of the board, to keep enough sources of supply around, even if they're in the medium run. The other one is to use this tool, and in particular, only scale it up. Make it more aggressive only if the suppliers you're dealing with refuse to play ball. And I'm going to come to that in a second. Just give me a moment. Okay, a couple of things. One of the issues with this is it increases supply in the future rather than now. I mean, the future could be the near future. But then again, current and future prices are related through stockpiling. So, there's an argument that this will also relax prices now. All right. All right. There is also a point. So we're going until 1:30. Is that correct?
Yes, we can go a little bit further.
Okay. So I have a few things to go over.
Yes. Take your time.
Okay. Well, it is what it is. Second use is
sometimes we go till 2.
Okay. I'll keep it within the time allotted. A second use of demand is this idea of encouraging deviations, right? It's saying whatever applies for entrants, you could also apply for people who are already existing oil producers, and essentially also give them long-term bilateral forward contracts. It's just that you need to sort of essentially insure them for their existing production, right? Because these people can suffer from infra-marginal price impact, they suffer from price wars. So you would need to allocate them a fair amount of forward demand to be effective. I think it's just realistic, right? Right now, Saudi Arabia is not increasing its production because it wants stuff from the US, and it wants complicated stuff. It's not just that it wants higher prices, but it also wants, MBS to be persona grata again, and they want weapons and they want, intelligence. So what you give them in exchange may be a bit complicated. And that's clearly a dimension of the issue right now, right? Like if they produce more, it's basically deviation in the, essentially contract with Russia. They need to be insured against the consequences of those deviations. This is a little hard because you need more resources for that. So I think—
So who is making these decisions? They can't be outsourced to a board. No, it has to be the president of the United States deciding, I guess.
Sure. Absolutely. But I mean, I think it depends on the magnitude that we're talking about. So if we talk about a board that has, forward demand of 2% of, consumption, I think it's quite reasonable that you could allocate that externally. I think, the Fed has been dealing with a lot more money. Whether you allocate that, if you need more, I think at some point you need some political backing for this. But I think it's also important to announce that I think it's also important that it should be credible that you're going to scale up in case the cartel, in some sense, refuses to play its role and regulate supply, right? So I think one of the aspects that I would have liked to come to earlier, but that I've alluded to for a bit, is this idea that if you are a successful procurement board, you don't try to fight the cartel. Sort of this thing of you want to talk softly and carry a big stick. You want to try and cooperate with your suppliers while having some firepower behind if they choose not to cooperate. And I think this is where there is a policy outcome that's something I'm going to call, a win-win-win outcome for suppliers, buyer, and the environment. And, it's the idea that the objective need not be to have very low energy prices, but, stable, reasonably high prices might be a good goal, right? And so, that's a policy outcome that, has something for, suppliers, consumers, and environmental stakeholders, which is kind of all of us, right? And concretely, the way you do that is to condition the scale of the board mandate on energy prices, right? So that, if the suppliers play ball and they agree to enter a cooperative relationship, then you don't try to destabilize the cartel too much. You just have some small advanced purchase capacity to keep some suppliers around, especially with renewable energies. But then you have a commitment to provide a much bigger share of your consumption through advanced purchases, through targeted advanced purchases, if the prices remain high, and that you use that to destabilize the cartel in whatever way you can. And what this does is it gives the cartel incentives and suppliers incentives to be responsible partners.
So you would specify this in a law, or it would be very clear that if the oil price will go above 100, then we would destabilize the cartel, and this would be through advanced purchase agreements. And this would be
I think I would think about a couple of things. I would think of making it work at a small scale so that how you get some credibility. The second is, I think it's important not to overlook the fact that there are sort of individuals that are making decisions behind this. And so I think, even though this is sort of the spirit of the way you do this, is by having a thread that you can scale up in a reasonably credible way, I don't think you'd want to announce it in this sort of aggressive way. I think you'd need to work through it through diplomatic channels. Right? I mean, part of the reason for why the OPEC is not playing ball now is Mohammed bin Salman has been persona non grata for a couple of years for good reason, but it's one guy who's pissed off, and that makes a big difference. And so I think it's really important to take that into account. I think you'd want to think through this.
So, but then you're saying you can't have clear rules. It is more an implicit.
No, I mean, I think you need to build credibility, and I think you can build credibility. I think this speaks softly but carry a big stick. You can be credible, but not be, sort of in your face about, if you don't do this, then that, about setting an ultimatum. People don't react well to ultimatums. Somebody has raised their hand. Do you want to take this, or?
No, let's just move on because we have a little bit time constraints.
Okay. All right. Briefly, for how to use procure supply, one thing that I think is useful is once you have source supply, you want to prioritize allocation to the inelastic, high-value components of demand. So the people who are still consuming now and can't reduce their consumption even though the prices are very high. Okay, and what that does is it increases the elasticity of demand, and it makes the the residual demand discipline the market better. Okay, so there's also a supply side functioning of the board that I think is useful. Okay, let me skip on this. There are some precedents of interest. The European Steel and Coal Community is one. For advanced purchase boards, vaccines, and Operation Warp Speed is another. Okay, I want to talk briefly about
this. Is in spirit is the same. What Jean Monnet tried to propose for.
So So European Steel and Coal Community, there is a clear parallel, right? So we're out of a crisis. It's World War II. It's much worse. But Europe needs to be rebuilt. There is limited resources from the Marshall Plan, and there is a very strong German steel and coal cartel that the Americans think is responsible for World War II, essentially. The ESCC, which is the precursor to the European Union, is set up as a buyer's cartel, works through demand reduction, so it works differently, and it's able to do so because the purse is very centralized, basically Marshall funds. So there it's much easier to centralize purchases. There is a mandate from the US and pressure to build antitrust law at the time. So there are similarities, there are differences. So it shows it's possible, slightly different times too. Okay, two policies I want to talk about. The first one is this idea of taxing Russian oil. The second one is having a price cap. Okay, Russian oil, usual concerns. It's taxing Russian oil. There are distributional issues. Taxes are not popular. It could increase prices at a time of high inflation, and it's a very visible price. Here's what we have to contribute that's different: is a lot of this argument that says, the price of the marginal cost of extracting oil for Russia is $6 a barrel. So even if we tax Russia a lot, they will still produce. And not only that, consumers can substitute to other sources from other producers. I think that's a really correct view if you're dealing with a competitive market. Maybe even for an oligopolistic market, it's just not quite right for a collusive market. The first is, they don't have to produce and they may choose not to. And I think they may well choose not to. They have strategic goals. They operate as a strategic player with price impact. They could choose not to, and they might well not continue supplying. The second point, which I think is even more likely, is that there is no reason for OPEC to accommodate increased demand. They may, but they just got out of a price war. There's an uneasy truth. They may just choose not to increase production and let the price of oil shoot up. Okay, and so to me, the argument that this is a policy that the cost of which will be borne by Russia and not consumers is true in a competitive market, not quite right in a collusive market. Okay, second policy, price caps. Super intuitive and attractive to people on the street. Every time it's offered, economists think it's a terrible idea. I think it's one of the cases in which it is not a terrible idea. Okay, and the reason for this is a price cap. It's a bad idea when you have a competitive market, but we don't have a competitive market. What we have is essentially a bilateral bargaining relationship. And so the rationale for price caps is the same one as the rationale for having a reserve price when you run an auction. When you run an auction and there are not so many people who can participate, you put a reserve price and they're going to be above that reserve price. That leads to inefficient trade some of the time, but it extracts better terms as well. Price caps, they may lead to rationing, but if you're facing a non-competitive market, it may also effectively improve your terms of trade, and sometimes even without reducing supply. It's not guaranteed to me that there would be a reduction in supply if they put a price cap.
How would you determine the level of the price cap? I mean, it probably depends a lot, like the reserve value in an auction, where you put the price cap. Is it a similar reasoning? Or?
Yeah, I think you'd have to do something like that. I think you could do it in a concerted way, and I'm going to develop this in a moment.
Okay.
Because I think there is a way to do that in a way that's collaborative with suppliers rather than purely aggressive, and I think it's the way it should be done. Mm-hmm. If you were forcing me to, spit out a number right now, I'd say $70 a barrel, and I cannot explain you why. Okay, the way, there are some issues related to this because, price caps can reduce entry, and we think entry is important right now. It may lead to rationing, and we would need a plan for that. It's also complex logistically because you need to ban side purchases. One thing that, for which we've done work on and that we believe is actually quite successful to deal with a cartelized set of suppliers, and especially to improve entry and make collusion more difficult, is to not just have price caps, which is said, the price cannot go above a certain level, but also have price floors. So you'd say something along the lines of the price cannot go above $90 a barrel, but also cannot go below $60 a barrel. And that does two things. A, that increases entry because now I know that I have a minimum price. That's pretty good. It disrupts cartel discipline because now the scope for price wars is much smaller. The scope for price impact is much smaller. The second aspect of this is that it favors cooperation between buyers and suppliers. The goal is not unlimited low prices. It's let's stay within some reasonable band so that there is some price action, there is some price signal, but we stay within something that's reasonable. Okay.
Well, just to make sure, if I have a price floor and the price were dropped to $6, I would say I still buy it at $20. I pay you some extra $14, or I buy and scale up my demand such that the price goes back up to $20 and put it in strategic reserves. How would the floor be enforced?
So, I mean, it sort of depends on the way you do it. I think you could put it, in the same way that you put an upper cap, it's kind of like the rule of a market that you're organizing. If you put a lower cap, you might have oversupply, and you should have rules to deal with that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, rationing, and so that's why in some sense this is not the proposal I lead with. rationing of either supply or demand requires some operational logistical power, that is a challenge, and that you think needs to be thought through. So we see that all the time in procurement by governments in which they're procuring services. So we know it's possible, but there, it's sort of, we don't build a school this year if they don't trade, or we just price, and it's kind of, there what they do is they don't record a lower price. So, you'd get into trouble as a government if somebody bid, quite low and you accepted a bid that's higher, because then it looks like you're basically corrupt. The way they do it is just by not letting people bid too low, and it's just, ruled out as a strategy. So they don't create the data in which they, refuse an offer that's better. Okay. I think over time, the one thing I like about this, last thing I like about this price floor is it also plausibly supports emissions goals by keeping the price of energy high, just at a reasonably high level. I think I'm out of time. We could talk about demand management, but I think this is quite different from what I've talked about. So I'm going to end now.
Thanks, Sylvain. A couple of more questions.
Sure.
So, of course, if you want to implement this, does the European Union have to change its competition law? Do you know that? Is it consistent with the current competition law? Could one country or some companies just make this advanced purchase agreements or this forward agreements, or is this all consistent with our competition law? Is very much driven in the thinking of non-strategic cartel.
Yeah, no, I mean, cartel. Presumably, yeah, I think presumably there may, I am just not there, I'm not the person to answer this question. I think presumably you need to think this through, existing constraints that come from the World Trade Organizations. Similar constraint may exist within Europe. I think you're right. I think you need to think how this deals with, basically anti-competitive measures. I think energy is a bit of a specific sector because it is such a strategic sector. I think you may be able to get exceptions for this. But yeah, I think it's a fair point.
And there are two ways to approach this. One is to say, the heads of states making these decisions, because it involves, as you said, other big persons. It involves strategic and arms deals and other things at the end of the day. Or do you think it should be outsourced to an agency, like an agency which is independent, because there's some, like for central banking, there's a time inconsistency problem, and that because of this time consistency problem, we outsource it to an agency to overcome this time consistency problem. What is the ideal institutional structure and the ideal processes to come to the strategic thinking? I mean, there has to be a board of experts making recommendations, but who ultimately will make the decision
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's good to have technocrats so that politicians can blame them, when things are not okay. And I think it's probably a useful resource.
Yeah, on the other hand, you also want to have accountability in a sense.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think there are sort of two levels. I think if you just think about the beginning of this, where you are, let's say you're pledging 2% of your demand. Okay, I think this maybe you could try. Maybe it's reasonable that you could try at the beginning to get a process started, to get a set of rules, to have it through somebody. You could also do it unilaterally via some country. I think surely you'll need political buy-in if you need to go above. If you really need to scale up, these advanced process contract in a big way. Again, I think one thing that's nice for this is that I don't think you need that much coordination between buyers to start having something that works. I think the incentives to join such a purchase board are actually pretty good. I haven't talked about this, but you could think of allocating more of the sourced supply to participants that have participated at scale in the, early on. So I think the incentives to join are actually not that bad. as to how it should be run, I think we have some examples on how to try to do this, but it's not like they're not controversial, but central banks to me are a good example of, yeah, they have a lot of power. They are submitted to some oversight, but they get to do a lot of, to have a lot of impact on markets as well. And I think that's one model. The IEA is another model where you're just coordinating actions. You're serving as a coordinator. You elaborate policies, you coordinate, try and coordinate information and coordinate procedures, and then you let individual actors follow up on the recommendations you make. And that's another way to go about it.
So you mentioned that the US could take a lead, or the European Union could take a lead in this advanced purchase agreement or the other strategic moves. Which of the two has a better? I mean, they're very different in a sense. US is an energy exporter. Europe is very much an energy importer. Would you say the US is in a better position, or Europe is in a better position, or both should move ahead? And let's suppose if they can't coordinate among themselves. And what role should countries like China or India play? Do they have the same incentives like the rest of the world?
I mean, so, I think in the US, I think it's actually a pretty clear case, right? And I think somebody was referring to proposals that Laura Allen, I think, was referring to, pretty similar proposals have been made. And I think the US has a pretty clear use case, because it would basically doing internal transfers, if at all. So I think the US is perhaps the place I would start. It's also, the shale, shale producers are the ones that are, got pretty burned. So they are not willing to come in. But at the same time, these are also the wells that could be put into, that could be producing quite fast. So I think it's a clear case. What you do in Europe, you might want to be doing different things in Europe, because there it's less clear how you don't have an internal set of suppliers. So I think it's a little harder, but you might be able to play with the electricity market. So there are a number of policies that you could take with the electricity market to sort of encourage entry in Europe, whether it's storage, whether it's, for peak pricing solutions, right? So, in Europe, one thing that you have is well, it's less good than in the US and Asia, but you have reasonably good penetration of smart electric meters. If you use those to do, load, peak pricing, you reduce gas demand, and that's a possibility that, could be useful there. So by, contract, so that's an angle you could take there.
So can you elaborate on this? So if I have smart meters, and I use people to spend when there's excessive supply, that to use the energy then, and use less energy when there's not enough supply.
Yeah, that's exactly
the prices. How would this help in this context?
So it's the two following ideas is, we don't meter gas very well at a high frequency. Gas is frequently used as a way to deal with demand variations related to electricity production. For instance, when renewables are not functioning, and so gas is sort of the fast varying buffer. But you could try and reduce gas, and by reducing the volatility of residual demand, essentially. And one way to do that is to reward people when they don't consume electricity at the time when it would be produced through gas, right? And so that's an advanced market commitment that Europe could make. Now you don't have a ton of entry for, load pricing solutions. It's a hard, marketing sell. It's not something that's super popular, but, you could build an advanced market commitment for this type of solution. And that's something that would directly ease dependency on gas for electricity.
So in other words, putting it in your elasticity of demand, you would make the demand elasticity go up, because people can smooth, and hence they would react more to increase in prices.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly demand elasticity go up, but yeah, it is this thing about now there is no elasticity because people don't know the price of gas. And via the electricity market and via, this, metering and, communication technology and incentives technology, yeah, you'd heighten the effective elasticity of demand through gas by improving incentives and information.
How quickly do you think this, so let me stop with the final question, how quickly could such a scheme be implemented? And is it a matter of years, or can we do it in a few months? How complicated is it? And the whole institutional arrangements? And
if you got a large tech company to pledge resources to this idea, I think you could do it reasonably fast. I say this for a couple of reasons. One is, depending on the country, there is pretty high penetration of smart meters already. So Germany is actually not one of the best players, but Scandinavian countries, France, Italy, England have half decent smart meter penetration. Asia has really good smart meter penetration for electricity, the US too, it's about 70%. So that infrastructure is, in part in place. So then what you need is software. And we have already quite a bit of an idea of how to run, load pricing. People have been talking about forever. There are software solutions that, are available. So, I think with the budget of a pretty good startup, you could get something running relatively fast.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Sylvain, for outlining the vision here. I think it's great. Of course, I'm biased. And let's hope that something like this will become a reality. And it also shows what I like about it. It shows, how game theoretic thinking can actually impact the real world dramatically. And that our thinking often is in our old world, where we think everything is competitive and the first best and all this, but we're really in the second, or as you called it, third best. And then we have to also think about the optimal response in a world when there's a second best or third best world we're living in. So thanks again. And we stay in touch and keep talking about it and think about institutional features. And we are happy for all of us who stayed with us. And if you have any suggestions along these lines, we're very grateful if you could pass it on to us. Next Thursday will be Jonathan Payne. He will talk about DeFi, tokens and platforms and smart CBDCs. So that will be a different topic, but it's also about our future. And see you next week. Bye-bye.